Why did the room feel smaller the moment the door shut behind them? The sound was soft, almost polite, but something in the way the latch clicked told her this wasn't a coincidence. Staff Sergeant Kira Ventura didn't turn right away. She finished unlacing her boots first. One lace, then the other, slow, measured. Her heartbeat stayed calm even as the air shifted behind her. 3 sets of boots, Ranger issue, well broken in, not students, cadre. She straightened, rolled her shoulders once and finally faced them. They were blocking the exits without realizing they were doing it, a habit learned in hallways and doorways in places where dominance mattered. The tallest one stood closest, confident, a little too eager. The second leaned against the lockers like this was already over. The third hovered near the door, unsure where to put his hands. She saw all of it, the tension, the resentment, the story they'd already written about her. "You want to play me?" the tall one said, smiling without warmth. "Fine." That word again. Play. Like this was a game. Like she hadn't buried friends. Like she hadn't held a man's life between her fingers while bullets cut the air inches from her face. She said nothing. Silence had always unnerved people more than anger. They thought they knew who she was. They thought they'd finally caught the general's daughter pretending to be ordinary, pretending to belong. They didn't see the scar along her jaw as a warning. They saw it as decoration, or luck. They stepped closer. And somewhere deep in her chest, not anger, but memory began to rise. She learned early what it meant to be watched. Growing up on bases meant eyes everywhere, expectations everywhere. Her last name carried weight long before she understood what weight really cost. When other kids talked about their parents' jobs, hers learned to stop asking questions. Her father was either leaving or gone. Her mother filled the silence with patience and tired smiles, hands that healed bodies while quietly holding a family together. At 15, Kira learned that wanting something badly didn't mean you were allowed to have it. When she told her father she wanted to enlist, not commission, not follow the polished path he laid out, the disappointment in his voice felt heavier than any punishment. He said no. She said yes anyway, and the space between those answers stretched into years. Changing her name wasn't rebellion, it was survival. She didn't want favors she didn't ask for, didn't want whispers following her into every formation. She wanted to know, really know, that if she failed, it would be her failure, and if she succeeded, no one could take it from her. So she became invisible, and then she became excellent. She didn't talk about Ranger School unless asked. Didn't talk about the mountains, the hunger, the moment her hands shook during the knot test and cost her the first attempt. She only talked about going back, about finishing. She didn't talk about Afghanistan unless necessary. Didn't talk about the Peak River Valley, about the way time bent during an ambush, about how training collapsed into instinct when men started screaming. She didn't talk about the feel of an artery under her fingers, or the moment she realized that doing everything right still wasn't enough. Those memories stayed locked inside her, silent but sharp. And now, standing in that locker room, she felt them stir. "Say something," one of them snapped. She exhaled slowly. They mistook her calm for fear. The shove came next. It wasn't hard, not meant to be, just enough to remind her of her place as they saw it, a test, a provocation. That was their mistake. She didn't respond with rage. She responded with clarity. The movement was efficient, clean, wrist turned, elbow locked, momentum redirected. The sound of bone against metal echoed like a gunshot. The smile vanished. Blood followed. The second man moved too fast, too angry. She used his weight against him. The floor met him hard. He didn't get back up right away. The third froze. "Leave," she told him. He did. The room went quiet again except for breathing and blood. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not to assert dominance but to make sure it was over, truly over. She learned that lesson the hard way too. Later alone, The adrenaline finally hit. Her hands shook then, just a little. She sat on the bench and stared at the floor, wondering, not for the first time, how many versions of herself she'd had to become just to be taken seriously, wondering why dignity so often demanded silence. She knew what would come next. Paperwork, investigations, names surfacing, her father's name. The thing she'd spent years outrunning was about to catch her. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep running. Why did truth always arrive with consequences? Monday morning came with fluorescent light and the weight of expectation. The commander's office smelled like old coffee and responsibility. She stood at attention, class as crisp, expression neutral. He didn't waste time. Tell me what happened. So she did, plainly, without embellishment, without apology. She expected skepticism, she got none. What she didn't expect was understanding. When he told her he'd known who her father was all along, something inside her tightened. Not anger, disappointment maybe, or relief, she wasn't sure which. When he told her the audio had been recorded, that the truth was clear, she felt the smallest release of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. When he told her about the phone call to her old unit, to men who remembered exactly what she'd done under fire, she closed her eyes for a brief second. They remembered. When he slid the memo across the desk, signed years ago in her father's hand, she felt something crack open. He hadn't been pulling strings. He'd been cutting them. She left the office lighter than she entered, but heavier in a different way, because now there were questions she could no longer avoid. That night, she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end was careful, familiar, older. "Are you okay?" he asked. That was all it took. The distance collapsed in a rush of words, of silence, of grief and pride tangled together. For the first time, she let herself be seen, not as a soldier, not as a symbol, but as a daughter who had carried too much alone. When the call ended, the apartment felt different, quieter, not empty, just open. Weeks later, an apology came in a hallway, awkward, earnest. She accepted it without ceremony, not because it erased what happened, but because growth mattered more than punishment. She stayed. She taught. She demanded precision, not perfection. She reminded her students that lives depended on details, on humility, on doing the work even when no one was watching. On weekends, she drove north and rebuilt something fragile with a man who was learning how to be present. And sometimes, when the base was quiet and the air heavy with Georgia heat, she touched the scar along her jaw and remembered the cost of standing her ground. Strength she'd learned wasn't loud. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the memory choose now to come back to her, sharp and uninvited, just as the locker room went quiet? Kira stayed where she was after the door finally swung shut, the echo of boots fatting down the hallway. The hum of the fluorescent lights returned, louder than before, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. She leaned back against the cold metal lockers and let the moment stretch, not because she was shaken, but because she knew better than to rush past the aftermath. This was the part no one ever trained you for, the silence after restraint, the space where adrenaline searched for somewhere to land. Her hands trembled then, just slightly. She pressed her palms together until the shaking eased. She learned that trick overseas. Let the body do what it needed to do, then bring it back under control. Panic was loud. Discipline was quiet. She replayed the encounter in her mind, not with regret but with assessment, positioning, initiation of contact, proportional response, termination of threat. Everything lined up. Everything would stand up to scrutiny. And still a familiar knot tightened in her chest, not fear of consequences but exhaustion. She was tired of having to be exact, tired of knowing that mistakes were allowed for others but never for her. She finished changing, relaced her boots, and stepped back into the heat of the Georgia afternoon. The sun hit her face, bright and indifferent. Cadre vehicles rolled past. Laughter drifted from somewhere near the parking lot. Life moved on, unaware of how close it had brushed against something uglier. She drove home in silence. That night, sleep came in fragments. She dreamed of mountains first. Cold, wind cutting through wet uniforms, fingers numb, struggling with rope that refused to cooperate. She heard an instructor's voice calling time, felt the familiar drop in her stomach as she realized she was too slow. Again. Then the dream shifted. Dust, heat, the sharp crack of gunfire. Someone yelling her name, not shouting but trusting, always trusting. She woke before dawn, heart steady but mind already running. She showered, dressed, and left early. Routine had always been her anchor. If she kept moving, the doubts couldn't catch up. By mid-morning, the whispers had started. She didn't hear them directly. She never did. But she saw the signs. Conversations that paused when she entered a room. Eyes that lingered a fraction longer than before. A staff sergeant she barely knew nodding at her with something like respect or curiosity. News traveled fast on bases, faster when blood was involved. She focused on her work. Teaching casualty care demanded attention, tourniquet placement, needle decompression, airway management under stress. She watched students struggle, encouraged them without coddling, corrected them without cruelty. When one hesitated, hands shaking as he tried to find the right landmark, she stepped closer. "Slow down," she said quietly. "You have time right now. You won't always use it." He nodded, swallowed, and tried again. She recognized the look in his eyes, the fear of failing publicly, the pressure to prove something. She wondered who he was trying to impress. Himself, maybe, or a version of himself he hadn't met yet. During a break, she stepped outside, letting the sun warm her face. She closed her eyes briefly and thought of her mother, of the way she used to say, "You can't control how people see you, only how you show up." Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, short, formal. "SSG Ventura. Please report to RTB HQ Monday 7:45. She stared at the screen longer than necessary. So it begins. The weekend stretched out ahead of her, heavy with anticipation. She spent it cleaning an apartment that was already spotless, meal prepping food she barely touched, running longer than usual just to feel the burn in her lungs. At night, she sat on the couch, lights off, city noise drifting in through an open window. She thought about the past she'd buried so carefully. She thought about the Silver Star citation she'd read once and never again. The way it reduced chaos to clean sentences. The way it couldn't capture the smell of blood or the sound of a man trying not to drown in his own airway. She thought about the Rangers who'd never questioned her right to be there, who'd watched her work under fire and never once asked whose daughter she was. Those memories steadied her. Monday morning arrived crisp and merciless. She stood outside the commander's office, spine straight, expression neutral, and waited to be called in. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and floor cleaner. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. It felt wrong, but she understood it. The army didn't pause for personal reckonings. Inside the office, the commander listened without interruption. His eyes never left her face. When she finished, he leaned back slightly, hands folded, and studied her in a way that felt less like judgment and more like evaluation. She braced for the question she'd avoided for years. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. She answered honestly, because it shouldn't matter, because she wanted to be measured by her work, because carrying that name changed how people listened. He nodded once. When he revealed that he'd known all along, a flicker of something passed through her, surprise maybe, or disappointment, or relief, she wasn't sure which. The investigation details came next. The audio, the corroboration, the phone call to her old unit. When he spoke about the ambush, about the things men who'd been there still remembered, she felt her throat tighten. She kept her posture perfect anyway. Years of discipline didn't evaporate just because the truth was finally being spoken out loud. Then came the memo. She stared at the paper as if it might dissolve. Her father's signature looked the same as it always had, precise, controlled, final. Non-intervention. He hadn't been absent. He'd been deliberate. The realization hit harder than any accusation ever had. When she left the office, the world felt slightly off balance, not because something had gone wrong, but because something she'd believed for years no longer held true. That night she sat in her car with the engine off, phone resting in her hand. The number felt heavier than it should have. Calling meant reopening wounds she'd worked hard to cauterize. Not calling meant staying exactly where she was, alone but safe. She dialed. The ring felt endless. When he answered, she almost hung up. Instead, she spoke. The conversation wasn't neat. It wasn't forgiving right away. There were pauses where neither of them knew what to say. There were truths laid down carefully like fragile equipment. But there was something else too. Respect. Not the rank kind, the earned kind. When he said he was proud of her, not as a father claiming credit but as a soldier recognizing another, something inside her finally loosened. After the call, she cried harder than she had in years, not because she was weak, but because she no longer had to be invincible. In the weeks that followed, consequences landed where they should have. Reassignments, quiet removals, no public spectacle, just accountability, the way it was supposed to work. One afternoon, a familiar face stopped her in the hallway. An apology followed, awkward, earnest, unpolished. She accepted it not because it erased what happened, but because people were allowed to learn. She went back to teaching, back to correcting hand placement, back to reminding soldiers that arrogance killed faster than bullets, back to being exactly who she'd always been. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low over Fort Moore and the day finally slowed, she thought about how close she'd come to walking away from her own story. Strength, she understood now, wasn't just about standing your ground. Sometimes it was about letting yourself be known. And sometimes it was about trusting that the truth, however delayed, would arrive when it was needed most. What if the hardest battles weren't fought in valleys or locker rooms, but in the quiet moments when no one was watching? Kira noticed the shift before anyone said her name out loud. It was subtle, too subtle for people who didn't live inside systems like this. Doors that opened a second faster, emails that suddenly included her in longer chains, a captain who lingered after a briefing, asking questions he could have asked anyone else. Respect didn't announce itself. It crept in carefully, testing whether it was welcome. She didn't change how she walked, didn't soften her voice, didn't sharpen it either. She learned long ago that reacting to perception only fed it, so she stayed steady. Let the work speak. Let time do what it always did, separate noise from truth. Still inside, something was unsettled. For years, her identity had been clean, simple. I am a medic, I am an instructor, I am accountable to my students and the soldiers they would one day be responsible for. Now another layer had been added back onto her life, one she deliberately peeled away at 18. Daughter, legacy, expectation. She didn't want either title to cancel the other out. During training that week, she pushed harder than usual, not out of anger but necessity. She needed friction, needed to feel useful. One scenario ran long into the afternoon, simulated chaos stretching tempers thin. A student froze under pressure, tourniquet half applied, eyes wide. Kira crouched beside him. "Look at me," she said, low enough that only he could hear. "You're not wrong yet, you're just paused, breathe." He did. "Now finish." When he succeeded, relief washed over his face. Pride followed. She saw it, and for a moment she felt something close to peace. This was why she stayed. That night she ran until her legs burned and her thoughts finally slowed. The base perimeter blurred into muscle memory. Breath in, breath out, footfall, rhythm. When she stopped, hands on knees, sweat cooling on her skin, the past found her again anyway. It always did when she was tired. She thought of the first deployment where she'd been the only medic attached to a platoon that didn't know her yet. How they'd watched her hands during the first casualty drill. How silence had followed when she didn't hesitate. Respect earned in increments measured by blood and time. She thought of Sergeant First Class Holt. She didn't think about his death often, not directly. She thought about the 11 minutes before it, about the trust in his eyes, about the impossible math of battlefield medicine where effort didn't guarantee outcome. That was the part civilians never understood. You could do everything right and still lose. And somehow, you had to carry that without letting it hollow you out. The phone call with her father replayed in her mind too. Not the words but the tone, the restraint, the admission of pride that had come without expectation attached. It was new territory, uncomfortable, fragile. She wondered if reconciliation was just another form of courage. Weeks passed. The incident became background noise, then memory. New problems replaced old ones as they always did. Training cycles rotated. Students graduated. Some shook her hand with genuine gratitude, others with quiet respect. A few with something like awe, though she never encouraged it. She corrected them when they mythologized medicine. "This isn't hero work," she told them. "It's responsibility, don't confuse the two." One afternoon, she was called to assist with a live fire exercise as an observer, not because she needed to be there, but because someone thought she should be. Progress didn't always come dressed as opportunity. Sometimes it came as visibility. She stood at the edge of the range, helmet strapped, eyes scanning movements she'd seen 100 times. Everything looked clean, disciplined, controlled. Until it was. A trainee stumbled during a bounding movement. Nothing dramatic, but wrong enough. A weapon angled where it shouldn't. A split second where possibility opened its mouth. Kira moved before anyone called ceasefire. Her voice cut clean through the noise. The exercise stopped. The mistake corrected. No injury, no incident report. Afterward, a major approached her. "Good catch," he said. She nodded once. That was all. Later, alone, she thought about how instinct had carried her forward again. How the same reflex that had driven her into a kill zone now kept others safe in training. The thread was consistent. Protect first. Explain later. That instinct had cost her things too. She remembered coming home from deployment and feeling out of sync with everything familiar. Grocery store aisles too bright. Conversations too shallow. The way people thanked her without knowing what they were thanking her for. She learned to keep that distance. It was easier than bridging it. One evening, she received an email from a name she hadn't expected. Amanda Holt. She stared at the screen for a long time before opening it. The message wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It thanked her, not for saving Marcus because the writer knew better than to frame it that way, but for staying with him, for not letting him be alone, for giving him every chance that existed in that moment. Kira read it twice, then a third time. Something inside her chest ached, not sharply but deeply, a grief that had been waiting patiently for permission to surface. She replied carefully, honestly. She didn't promise closure, she didn't offer explanations. She shared what she could without reopening wounds, that Marcus had fought, that he'd trusted, that he hadn't been abandoned. When she sent the reply, her hands were steady. Healing, she realized, wasn't about erasing pain. It was about placing it somewhere it could be carried. On a Saturday a few weeks later, she drove north. Lunch with her father had become routine, not formal, not forced. Just two people learning how to speak without rank or resentment in the way. They talked about her mother often, about her quiet strength, about the way she'd always believed reconciliation was possible even when neither of them did. "She was right," her father said once, staring into his coffee, "about more things than I admitted." Kira smiled faintly. They didn't talk about promotions or commands. They talked about responsibility, about regret, about the cost of choices made with good intentions. When she drove back that evening, windows down, sky turning gold, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Balance. Back at Fort Moore, life continued its steady rhythm. There were new students, new challenges, new quiet tests of credibility, but something had changed, not around her but within. She no longer felt the need to disappear. Not because she wanted attention, but because she'd earned the right to exist fully as a soldier, a medic, a daughter, a woman who had carried weight and learned how to set some of it down. Late one night, alone in the training facility, she cleaned and reset equipment for the next day. The building was quiet, almost reverent. She paused, hands resting on a stretcher frame, and let herself breathe. Strength, she understood now, wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about knowing who you were when no one was asking. And resilience wasn't loud. It didn't announce victories or demand recognition. Sometimes it was simply the decision to stay, to teach, to heal, to keep showing up, scarred, capable, and unafraid of being seen. What happens when the noise finally fades, and you're left alone with the person you've become? Kira didn't notice the quiet at first. It crept in gradually, replacing the constant friction she'd grown used to. No sideways glances, no hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, just work. Honest, demanding, unglamorous work, the kind she trusted. That unsettled her more than conflict ever had. She'd spent years calibrated to resistance, to skepticism, to the unspoken challenge that hovered around women who carried themselves with too much confidence in places built by and for men. When that pressure eased, it left space she wasn't sure how to fill. She filled it with preparation. She arrived earlier than necessary, stayed later, rewrote lesson plans she already knew by heart, adjusted scenarios not to make them harder but more real, more human. She wanted her students to understand that casualty care wasn't just a checklist, it was a moral act performed under pressure. During one session, she asked a simple question that caught them off guard. "Who are you responsible for when this goes wrong?" Hands went up, the casualty, the mission, the team. She nodded at each answer. "All of that," she said, "and yourself, because if you panic, someone dies, and if you lie to yourself about your limits, someone else pays." The room was silent. She didn't soften the message. She never had. That night, she dreamed of her mother. Not sick, not fragile, just standing in the kitchen of their old on-post housing, hands dusted with flour, smiling the way she used to when Kira came home late from cross-country practice. "You don't have to carry it all alone anymore," her mother said. Kira woke with tears on her face and no sense of embarrassment about it. Grief, she'd learned, didn't follow rank or logic. It waited until it was safe. The following week, a training accident shook the brigade. Not catastrophic, but close enough to leave a mark. A heat casualty during a long movement. Dehydration compounded by pride. The soldier recovered, but the aftermath lingered. Questions, briefings, quiet recalculations of risk. Kira was asked to speak to the cadre. She stood in front of them, hands resting loosely at her sides, and didn't raise her voice. "We push people because combat doesn't care about comfort," she said. "But discipline means knowing when pressure stops being productive. The line is thin. Miss it, and you don't build warriors, you break them." No one argued. Later, alone in her office, she sat with the weight of that truth. She thought about the times she'd ignored her own limits, about the nights overseas when she'd skipped sleep, skipped meals, skipped grief because there were others who needed more. She wondered how much of that had been strength and how much had been avoidance. The email from Amanda Holt stayed in her inbox, flagged but unopened since the reply. Kira reread it that night anyway. The words hadn't changed, but she had. They no longer felt like a wound. They felt like a responsibility, one she could honor without drowning in it. On a quiet Saturday morning, she visited the Post Chapel, not for faith exactly, for stillness. The space was empty, light filtering through high windows, dust motes drifting like unspoken prayers. She sat in the back and let herself be small for a moment. She thought about the people she'd lost, the versions of herself she'd shed to survive, the way resilience sometimes demanded hardness, and how that hardness could calcify if left unexamined. She didn't ask for forgiveness, she asked for clarity. When she left, the air felt lighter. Her relationship with her father continued to evolve, less guarded now, less careful. They still didn't agree on everything. They didn't need to. Respect had replaced distance, and that was enough. One afternoon, over lunch, he said something that surprised her. "You don't need my permission to define success," he said. "You never did." She studied him for a long moment, then smiled, not tightly, not politely, but with genuine warmth. "I know," she said, "but it helps that you know it too." Back at Fort Moore, a young female medic approached her after class, hesitant, nervous. "Staff Sergeant," she said, "how do you deal with people who already think they know your story?" Kira considered the question carefully. "You let them," she said finally, "and then you live well enough that their version can't survive contact with reality." The medic nodded, eyes bright. That night, Kira sat on her balcony, listening to distant traffic and cicadas. The world felt wide again, not threatening, not demanding, just open. She realized something then. She hadn't just survived the confrontation, the investigation, the reckoning with her past. She integrated them. They were no longer loose ends pulling at her from different directions. They were part of a single narrative she could stand inside without flinching. Identity, she understood, wasn't fixed. It was forged, over time, under pressure, through choice. And sometimes, growth wasn't dramatic. Sometimes, it was the quiet decision to rest. To forgive, not just others but yourself. To accept that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites, but partners. As the night deepened, she felt a steady certainty settle in her chest. She didn't need to prove she belonged. She already did. And the truest measure of her resilience wasn't what she endured, but what she allowed herself to become once the fighting stopped. What do you do when the armor you built to survive finally becomes too heavy to keep wearing? Kira felt it during a routine drill, of all things. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, no near miss. Just a student fumbling a pressure dressing while sweat ran into his eyes, panic creeping up his spine. She corrected him calmly, the way she always did. He nodded, fixed the mistake, and moved on. But something inside her stalled. For the first time in years, she felt the delay, not in her hands, but in her heart. A momentary fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind that comes from carrying a life at full readiness for too long. She dismissed it, she always did. The army rewarded endurance, quiet suffering, the ability to keep going without complaint. She learned that lesson early and internalized it too well. But endurance, she was starting to realize, had a shelf life if it wasn't paired with care. That evening she sat alone in her apartment, uniform folded neatly beside her, dinner untouched. The room was clean, silent, safe, and still she felt restless. Her phone buzzed. A message from her father, short and unassuming. "You eating tonight?" She stared at it longer than necessary before replying. "Not really." The response came almost immediately. That wasn't a question. She smiled despite herself. Later that night, she pulled out an old notebook she hadn't opened since her last deployment. It wasn't a journal. She didn't write feelings. She wrote facts, names, times, procedures. after-action fragments that helped her process chaos by organizing it. She flipped through pages filled with cramped handwriting. Casualty assessments, grid coordinates, medication dosages. And then one page near the middle, written shakily in a different pen. Holt 1140, held artery didn't let go. She closed the notebook and rested her palm on the cover. She'd never given herself credit for that moment, not really. She framed it as duty, as expectation, as the minimum required. Anything else felt like arrogance, or worse, self-indulgence. But denying the weight of it hadn't made it lighter. The next morning she requested time off. Not leave, just a day. The request raised an eyebrow. She rarely asked for anything, but it was approved without comment. She drove without a destination at first, letting highways blur into back roads. Eventually, she found herself at a small state park, quiet and nearly empty. She walked a trail until the sounds of engines disappeared, replaced by wind through trees and the crunch of gravel underfoot. She sat on a bench, overlooking a narrow river, and let herself be still. For years, stillness had felt dangerous. Inactivity gave memories room to breathe. But now she stayed, let the thoughts come. She thought about the medic she'd been at 21, eager, sharp-edged, desperate to prove she deserved the tab she wore. She thought about the woman she was now, competent, respected, tired in a way she hadn't expected. She realized she'd never grieved properly. Not her mother, not Holt, not the version of herself she'd sacrificed to become this one. Tears came quietly, no sobbing, just release. She didn't wipe them away. When she returned to base the following day, something had shifted, not outwardly. She still walked the same, spoke the same, taught with the same precision, but the internal pressure had eased. She started mentoring more intentionally, not just correcting mistakes but asking questions, listening. One afternoon, she sat with a young medic who reminded her painfully of herself, all intensity and self-denial. "You don't have to earn rest," Kira told her. "You earn competence. Rest is what keeps it intact." The medic looked unconvinced. Kira didn't push. Lessons like that took time. A letter arrived a week later. Handwritten. From Amanda Holt. This one was longer. It talked about the girls, about how they'd asked what kind of person their father had been with at the end, about how Amanda had told them he'd been with someone brave and steady, someone who didn't give up on him. Kira read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. That night she slept deeply. No dreams, just rest. Weeks passed. A new training cycle began. Fresh faces, fresh expectations. Kira found herself smiling more, small, private smiles, but real. She laughed once during a class when a student made a self-deprecating joke. The sound surprised her. It felt good. Her father noticed the change the next time they met. "You look lighter," he said. "I am," she replied. They talked about the future, not promotions, not commands, possibilities, teaching at a higher level, writing curriculum, shaping how medics were trained long after she moved on. The idea didn't intimidate her, it grounded her. Legacy, she realized, didn't have to mean a name etched in stone. It could mean hands trained, lives saved by people you'd never meet. One evening, after a long day, she stood alone in the training bay, lights dimmed, equipment stacked neatly. She ran a hand along a stretcher frame, the metal cool beneath her fingers. She thought about armor, about how it had protected her when she needed it, and how wearing it too long had started to cut off her breath. Strength wasn't just the ability to withstand impact. It was knowing when to set the weight down. And in that quiet space, surrounded by the tools of her trade, Kira understood something she'd never allowed herself to believe before. She didn't owe her suffering anything. Not silence, not endurance, not denial. She owed herself a future that was more than survival. And for the first time, She felt ready to claim it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same steady resolve that had carried her through every hard moment before. By choosing to live fully. What does redemption look like when no one is watching, and nothing needs to be proven anymore? Kira felt it one morning as she stood alone on the range before sunrise, the sky still dim, the world hushed in that rare space between night and duty. The air was cool, almost kind. She breathed it in slowly, deeply, the way she'd learned to do when chaos threatened to take over. But this time, there was no chaos chasing her breath. Only quiet. She spent most of her career braced for impact, waiting for doubt, for challenge, for someone to question whether she belonged. Now with those storms past, the stillness felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just new. The final training cycle at Fort Moore was nearing its end. Another class of medics would graduate soon, carrying forward what she'd poured into them. She watched them move through scenarios now with confidence that hadn't been there weeks ago. Their hands steadier, their voices clearer, their instincts sharper. They didn't know all of her story. They didn't need to. That was the thing she'd finally come to understand. Purpose didn't require an audience. One afternoon after class, she lingered behind while the students filed out. The training bay smelled faintly of disinfectant and canvas. She gathered stray bandages, reset equipment, performed the small rituals that closed a day's work. When she finished, she stood in the center of the room for a long moment, letting memory and gratitude share the space without competing. This place had held her at a turning point, had tested her restraint, her identity, her capacity to remain whole under pressure that wasn't measured in bullets or blood, but in judgment. And she had stayed. Not out of stubbornness, out of choice. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Lunch this weekend." She smiled and replied yes without hesitation. The drive north a few days later felt different than it once had. No rehearsed conversations, no emotional armor, just openness. They met at the same quiet restaurant they'd come to favor, neutral ground, halfway between past and future. They talked about her mother again, about the small things, the way she hummed when she cooked, the way she'd believed people could find their way back to each other if given time. "She'd be proud of you," her father said quietly. Kira nodded. She didn't argue anymore when he said things like that. She let them land. On the drive home, she thought about the idea of pride, how she'd once rejected it, fearing it meant complacency or arrogance. Now she understood it differently. Pride wasn't about comparison. It was about alignment, about knowing your actions matched your values. Back at Fort Moore, she submitted her next assignment preferences: teaching positions, curriculum development, places where experience mattered more than visibility. She didn't feel like she was stepping back. She felt like she was stepping into herself. On her last week before transition, a young soldier stopped her in the hallway, nervous, earnest. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "I just wanted to say you changed how I think about this job." Kira studied his face, the sincerity, the weight behind simple words. "Just do it right," she replied. "That's enough." He nodded, visibly relieved, and walked away. She watched him go, then turned back to her office and began packing, not hurriedly, thoughtfully. Each item held a memory, but none demanded to be clung to. The scar along her jaw caught the light in the window. She touched it once, gently, not with bitterness, not with pride. Just acknowledgement. That night, she sat on her balcony again, the familiar hum of the world below her. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, about the girl who'd changed her name to escape a shadow, about the medic who'd run toward gunfire because there hadn't been another option, about the woman who'd finally allowed herself to rest without guilt. She understood now that redemption wasn't a moment. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't an apology or a vindication. It was continuity. It was choosing integrity when no one demanded it, choosing restraint when anger would have been easier, choosing connection after years of isolation. It was choosing to stay soft in the places that mattered, without losing strength where it counted. As the night deepened, a sense of calm settled over her, not the fragile kind, but the earned kind. The kind that comes from having faced yourself honestly and not turning away. She didn't know exactly what came next. And for once that was okay. Because she trusted herself now. Trusted the instincts forged under pressure and tempered by reflection. Trusted that whatever role she stepped into next, she would carry the same quiet discipline, the same refusal to cut corners where lives were concerned. Her story didn't end with a confrontation or a revelation. It continued with intention. In the end, Kira had learned something the Army never wrote into manuals and never taught explicitly. That strength isn't about proving you're untouchable. It's about standing steady when touched, by doubt, by loss, by truth, and choosing your response with care. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.